Welcome, everybody. This is John Paul Mendoza, Dr. Speed Selling, and this is Raging Verbalist number 274. For those of you who are counting, and if those who are new, welcome. If you're an old hat, glad to have you back. And of course, we talk about a variety of different topics. A hot one today in the news, big things. We don't usually talk a lot about politics, but we might drift in there this time. And of course, with me, as always, is the ever lovely Sandra. Welcome, Sandra.
Hello, how are you doing?
Doing great. This has got to be an exciting topic. Wow, it's big in the news. And you can catch us on YouTube and, of course, our Facebook group, Position to Win Book, Position to Win Book. Okay, so Sandra, let's dive right in on this one.
All right, so we're talking about tariffs. Are they good or evil? So explain for us, what exactly are tariffs?
Well, a tariff is a tax or a duty that gets charged on goods, potentially also services, but mostly it started out as goods because that's what things were all about. And it's designed for a variety of things. First off, it's to protect and protect industries, protect people, raise revenue. I mean, it was a way to do that. And so yeah, over the years, but it's a tax. And if you ever go through an international airport and you see a duty-free shop, it all has to do with that you can buy a variety of things, usually liquor or cigarettes. I used to do that for a partner of mine they were still smokers, and his wife wanted a specific kind of brand, and I could buy it duty free. And I guess I was a cigarette mule for a couple of cartons every time I went through that international airport. So yeah, that's what tariffs are. They're a tax.
And how long have tariffs existed?
Well, that's the interesting thing because today, if you haven't been aware of it, tariffs are a big topic. Trump called it Liberation Day. I would probably call it tariff the crap out of people day. But again, just I'm a libertarian. I'm a free trader. But yeah, that was what was happening. But it's interesting that the media talks about this as if it's like a brand new thing. First recorded tariffs are like the second and third millennia before Jesus. And I'll tell you, it's a couple thousand, a couple hundred years or something before that. So talking about a long time. And what it was is that the Assyrians would tax the what is now Turkey from bringing goods in because, of course, they were fearful that the Turks were going to undercut them and be cheaper. The Romans said, "Hey, wait a second, let's do some tariffs ourselves," and they imposed tariffs both internally and externally. Internally were lower tariffs, sound familiar, and externally were much higher. And they were actually charging on luxury goods, so people weren't buying silk. If you're buying silk from China, even in the Roman days, was in trouble there. And they were designed to regulate commerce, just like today, and fund, of course, the empire's treasury. And then by the medieval Europe in the 1300s, going quickly bouncing around, guess what happens? Of course, is that tariffs, 13th century. Tariffs are there to protect local industries because the last thing you want to do is have a bunch of artisans. That would be people who would make things out of leather and wool and all of that, and say, well, let's not have these cheap guys come in and screw that up. So that's really it's a long history and it keeps going on. The Industrial Revolution really changed all of that in a very big way because, of course, outsourcing has been a controversial thing since time began, but it's not going to stop anytime soon.
And why are there tariffs?
Well, there's really three reasons. Number one is that you protect your home market. So you have a home market and you say, we're going to protect our producers. We're going to bring jobs home. And that's one thing to say. I mean, oftentimes doesn't make as much sense. There were high tariffs for goods that were built in the New World. That's one of the arguments and decided the Revolutionary War for the U.S. is they were going to put in, there were taxes that they wanted to put in, but more importantly, there were other taxes that were going to go in for U.S., or actually colony goods. So they're really to protect the home market. Two is to raise revenue. I mean, they're a great way to raise revenue. The U.S. had lots of tariffs early on. That's how they funded the government. So they had tariffs. So if you're going to buy something, going to buy French wine, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Well, got to have tariffs. Got to make sure that we collect some dough on this. And number three is they can control consumption. One of the interesting things, doing research, of course, for this is that there's this Canadian Dairy Board, and the Canadian Dairy Board is there to protect Canada from losing their dairy farmers. And this is and I didn't know about it until this week, but the Dairy Board prevents any dairy products without really high tariffs from coming into Canada. And that way, the dairy farmers of Canada are protected. In fact, they control this down to how much dairy gets produced, how the dairy gets distributed, what takes place, because they want to make sure that they're never held hostage by dairy. Now I don't think it'd make a very good movie, but a guy calls up and says, well, listen, you better accede to our demands, or I'm pouring this milk down the drain, look out, your cottage cheese is getting tossed, or whatever that might be. But that's an example of tariff, and that tariff is there because they want to protect their local industry. And if you're 35, 40 million people, that's the decision you make. But those are absolutely tariffs, and they're designed to protect the locals.
And how would you define fair trade?
As a libertarian, it's interesting because fair trade is one of those things that you say, well, could we live in a world with zero tariffs? Would that be possible? What would take place? And in theory, I guess it's a great idea. I mean, I like it as a kind of a philosophical, theoretical thing. But what happens is that you have people who say, well, we build stuff a lot cheaper. So what we can do is we can blow out our competition, or, wipe them from that country if we sell stuff cheap enough and we bring it in and we dump product. So there's a lot of concerns about dumping product. Now, I have to say that when tariffs really kind of got the little squinty eye, and circle looking at them, is that you had workers, and you had management, and and you had the government, but really this was long before truly the rise of the consumer. So globally we have 8 point something billion consumers because everybody's a consumer of something. So that becomes problematic. This is where we run into issues, and where there's a lot of well, we can't have our markets be open or not, just like the example of me talking about getting cigarettes. The Japanese are trying to protect the Japanese tobacco market. That isn't where I think you would ever grow tobacco, but that's what they do, and they build in things. So Ronald Reagan years ago comes into the White House, looks around, and says, well, okay, how do I help certain industries, and all of that. And Harley Davidson came to the White House, and they pleaded their case and said, well, we make these big motorcycles. The Japanese can obviously make big motorcycles. They're making millions of motorcycles, Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, Yamaha, etc. And we need protection. So they put in a level of tariffs to slow that process down and to protect it. And the whole idea was, we're going to help the industry get back up on its feet. They had struggled through the 70s because the whole world changed in the whole motorcycle arena, and off you go. Now, some could argue, well, that was good because that means Harley Davidson, which there are lots of Harley Davidson dealers around the country and all American owned and on and on. But was it a great idea? I don't know. I would say that I lean more towards the open and fair, let them fight it out. But on the other side, you have disproportionate valuations on things, which is like labor and regulations and all of those things. Now, if you're sitting there saying, well, okay, all right, so how am I going to survive in this new tariff world? How am I going to do what I need to do? It seems like the whole world has gone a little cuckoo and crazy. Well, while you're contemplating that, while you're thinking about that, all I can tell you is that maybe, just maybe, what you should be doing is reading a book. And the book you should be reading is Most Businesses Fail in the First 5 Minutes. It just takes them 3 to 5 years to realize it, position to win. Most important thing you can do is understand the position you're in. This is why when you look at the way tariffs work and all of these things, Economists believe that everybody will always buy the cheapest of anything. I don't believe that's true. There are lots of luxury brands or semi-luxury brands or other brands that do quite well. And you can learn how to make sure that you have the best position you possibly can. So you can pick it up physically from us at positiontowinbook.com, positiontowinbook.com. Also, you can go and get it from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million as a physical book, or you can get it as a digital book with Kindle, Nook, and Apple iBooks. And if you want to learn how to actually make better long distance meetings, check this out, Remote Work for a Better World. I should almost send it to some of these naysayers about remote work and see if I can get people to change their minds. And of course, if you ever want to get a little bit of raging verbalist in your life, you can always have a Raging Verbalist mug. You can fill it up with hot or cold drinks and nicely done. And you can pick that up at positiontowinbook.com. All right, Sandra, what is next?
All right. Is there an example of a big industry arguing about tariffs?
Oh, there's the biggest, and the biggest is the battle that's been going on for a very protracted, long term, which is Boeing versus Airbus. Now, before Boeing was the only manufacturer of large passenger jets, we had McDonnell Douglas, we had Lockheed, and it turned out that the world wasn't big enough for three different players all designing different planes. The European Union, or it wasn't even there wasn't even a European Union, but the Europeans decided that they were tired of having to buy just American. Now, they weren't going to buy like, at the time Soviet or Russian jets. So they decided that they wanted to support their aerospace industry, and they started giving them subsidies. So the argument that Boeing and Airbus has had for decades now is that Boeing says, look, since Airbus has been supported by France and Great Britain and other players, because they spread their supply chain all over Europe, these people are getting subsidies. So the government unfairly is financing these people because, of course, governments have deeper pockets, different need for return on investments. You're going to have a lot of really good, high paying jobs. Hear that a lot. So they're being subsidized. And the answer is yes, they are. On the other side, Airbus says, well, Boeing is no different because Boeing consolidated all of the big, McDonnell Douglas, and they bought all of these companies. And Lockheed Martin got out of the commercial airline business. And now, or airplane business, now, well, how is Boeing subsidized? Well, the claim from the Europeans is Boeing gets no competition contracts to build all of these military aircraft. That military aircraft bolsters and supports their business. It doesn't matter if they sell commercial or not. It's not quite true, but the argument can be made that they're both being subsidized. So there's an example of where both industries are subsidized by governments for what the governments believe are the right reasons. We have to keep people employed. We have to keep the intellectual property. We have to keep the know-how. And if we ever are going to get into a shooting war, we sure in hell better have the capability of building aircraft, which are very important if we got into a real crazy situation.
So is it possible to have zero tariffs with every country?
If you actually look at that's the interesting part about this concept of zero tariffs is that if you look at going back the last 75 years or the end of World War II going forward, is that tariffs in general have been going down. Slowly but surely, they've been going down here, there, everywhere. Not quite, but they've been going down. Now, the challenge of it is, of course, is that if you put a tariff on Colombian coffee, well, you're not going to grow coffee in, Minnesota. I guess you could build a big giant greenhouse and, bring in a guy with a burrow or something. I don't know. But I'm going to tell you, it's not going to be easy. So that will create somewhat of a distortion. And then the other part is that countries have different capabilities, they have different needs, they have different things. So I don't know if you ever get to zero, but what I do believe is you can get to fairer tariffs. Now, understand that tariff is only one part of the argument that's going on right now as we're recording this. And the other part is the regulatory environment, both to hinder industry and also to hinder access to industry. Was a shareholder of the tobacco company Philip Morris back in the 80s. And the complaint there was hard to sell cigarettes in Japan. Big consumer market. Lots of people smoked in Japan, had not done what the US and Canada and other countries, which had a precipitous drop. And they said, well, you can sell them here. And, you got to pay a tariff, which made it economically worse. But we have all these other laws, like the vending machine law. So you actually had to build a different kind of package for it, which at the time was viewed as a really expensive thing to do, given how they were spitting out, whatever number. So that became an issue. And so can you get to zero tariffs? Possibly. Is it really advantageous? I mean, Vietnam right now makes massive amounts of shoes. Are we going to bring making shoes back to the US or any industrialized country? Probably not in a mass market because, again, labor becomes the big issue. So zero tariffs are a wannabe, not necessarily a reality.
And given the current Trump tariff policy, what is the likely outcome?
Well, there's a white paper that was written back in November of 24, and it basically talked about the Great Reset, which I think Donald Trump and the Trump administration is following. And the interesting part about it is that the Great Reset is to say, listen, we can keep negotiating and we can keep negotiating. And by the way, this has been going on for a long time, right? This is centuries old. We have been negotiating tariffs and agreements for a very long period of time. I mean, we ended up with NAFTA and then we ended up with other agreements. And then we have GATT, which is the global something tariffs. So this is like the Great Reset. And the Great Reset is to say, that you pick up and, if you've ever played a board game and somebody gets really pissed off, they pick up the board game and they flip it up in the air and they go, well, we're going to do a reset. And so this is kind of like that massive reset. And can we bring everybody to the table? And that's where I think we're going to go. Now, it's trying to accelerate a normally slow and arduous process. On the other side, it has the potential to create some real disruption. We see it in the stock market. We see it in other industries. We see it in a variety of places. Is it going to open up the Canadian market for milk? I doubt it. Are we going to open up our market for soft lumber from Canada? Probably not as much because the soft lumber market in Canada would swamp the US market because, I mean, this is another one of those things. The government in Canada says, listen, if you'll plant the trees, they got a lot of land. You plant the trees, you harvest the trees, you pay us a fee, and then you replant trees. Essentially, it doesn't cost you anything for the land. It doesn't cost you anything for a variety of things. Well, that would be seen as unfair in a tariff war. So I think it's going to get maybe some improved agreements, but its true aim is to deal with the whole China situation. And China is an interesting one because China has done a couple of things to exacerbate the situation. Number one is theft of intellectual property. I mean, if anybody doesn't believe that that's happening, it happens. Number two is dumping, where they will dump products in the market and all of that. Number three is we see how, just an example, 450 automakers were spawned in China because they decided everybody needed to be building cars. Now they're down to 150. But the best numbers that I've been able to find is only 2 of the 150 are actually profitable. So they're willing to sell cars at a substantially lower price than is realistically possible. Now, does that mean that, they're not going to end up capturing a bunch of the world? Well, there's a lot of markets where, getting a cheap car, no matter who's paying for it, is better than not having a car at all. So I think it's going to at least bring people to the bargaining table. It's brought it to the surface. And for anybody who's surprised, Donald Trump has been talking about this since the 1980s. And he's the first guy to basically see. Usually, this is like really quiet. Nobody talks about it. I mean, yeah, there was NAFTA. We talked about that. And then, NAFTA became a question about, is it good or bad? And then, then there was the, other trade agreements. But this is like front page news.
And how do you respond to this if you're an entrepreneur, a business owner, or in marketing or sales?
Well, the first thing you have to think about, and this is a business that I'm involved in. About 15 years ago, we actually manufactured in Canada exclusively. And because it didn't fall under the right rules of NAFTA, we actually had to pay import duties, which, just profit out of our pocket. So we moved everything to the US. If in fact the bifurcation of tax policy, if you build everything in the US and you can prove you build it in the US and you're a US manufacturer, you're going to pay lower taxes. I think you're going to see people make that march and move their businesses or move manufacturing and get there. Now, is that a good thing? It can be. It's going to probably employ people here. The reality is, though, is that you have to deal with the changing economic times. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're a business owner, what you really have to think about is how does this affect me? And anything that you buy, you're going to have to ask yourself, I mean, is the tariff going to be that additional tax that I have to pay that's going to cost me some pretty serious dough? Now, if you're in the sales and marketing arena, just know that customers are going to be traumatized to a certain point, and if they're going to be traumatized, they will probably not be buying as quickly because they're going to say, well, we're going to take a wait and see. And that is the potential risk of the economy basically holding its breath until this thing kind of settles out. And if anybody knows when it's going to settle out, call us, find a way, because we can all make a bunch of money, because that is the multi-trillion-dollar question.
So, what are the risks?
Well, I don't believe there's any way that you're going to get every single car that's going to be purchased in the US built in the US. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it makes any sense at all. Cars built in Canada have been taking place now for many years. The Canadian auto industry does have an advantage over the US auto industry, lower labor costs, lower healthcare costs. So I think the risks are is that you're going to see distortions in the marketplace. And there's no better example. By the way, anybody who sits there and argues and says, well, this is Trump doing this partisan stuff. This is Trump, messing up on all of these things. I just want to give everybody just a quick history lesson. And that is that in 1964, yeah, that was 1964, then President Johnson put in what is called the chicken tax. And the chicken tax is a 25% tariff on a variety of goods. And they were a tariff put on potato starch and dextrin and brandy. Oh, and by the way, light trucks. Now, what do light trucks have to do with chickens? Well, it was a ruse. It was a belief that if you put in tariffs on light trucks, you would protect the US auto manufacturers. Now, what we learned is that as time has gone on, we have the information. When Johnson put this in place, the only light trucks that were being imported were from this company called Volkswagen. Their little weird trucks had 40 ball ripping horsepower. And I guarantee you that my father would have never bought one of those for his machine shop. I doubt that Sandra's family would have rushed out and said, give me one of them there underpowered Volkswagens to go out and work on the farm. I don't think so. But the reason for it, and this is why when somebody talks about it, and this is, I'm drifting into politics, but this is reality, still there, by the way. This is still there. We cannot buy little trucks. Toyota, Nissan, Mitsubishi, a bunch of Chinese companies build them. We can't buy light trucks here without a 25% tariff, which makes them very uncompetitive. Now, why did it happen? Why did, potato starch, dextrin, and brandy, those were lifted pretty quickly, but the chicken tax remains on small light trucks. Now, here's where it gets a little murky because we now have the recordings from the Johnson administration. So whenever somebody tells me that, well, Trump is being all political, we ought to stop him, the other side says. But nobody talks about the chicken tax. In fact, most people I meet who are on the other side, I'm a libertarian, most conservatives don't know anything about it. But check this out. Johnson's going to run for election. He wasn't elected before that. He became the president because of an assassination, and he ascended to it. And the UAW were rattling their sabers saying, we're going to strike in 64 unless we get some more dough. Johnson cut a deal with Walter Reuther of the UAW. Don't strike, support my civil rights legislation, which would come in my next term, and get your boys behind me so I win this election. And what I will do is I'm going to place this tariff on little trucks so that way they don't erode what even then, not, I mean, today it's even crazier, was a big part of the profitability of the major auto manufacturers. And that's what you end up with the tariff. So to me, the risks is that we get stuck and it gets lost to antiquity and this stuff doesn't get repealed. So I'm all for lower tariffs. And all I'm saying is abolish the chicken tax, because it's ridiculous that we can't go out and buy a little truck and have that. But that's just me. Hopefully you learned some things about tariffs and the good and the evil. Are they good? Sometimes. Are they evil? Absolutely. The real question is, are they a tax or a duty? And the answer is absolutely yes. So for myself, John Paul Mendoza, Dr. Speed Selling, and the ever lovely Sandra, this has been the Raging Verbalist number 274. And we'll see you next week on the Raging Verbalist.